Myra Melford is my guest today, pianist, bandleader, and composer. We're connecting over the internet. I apologize for my hoarse voice, Myra, but you won't catch anything from me down there in Berkeley. Here in Seattle, though, we're looking forward to catching you and Fire and Water Quintet on Sunday, October 27th at Town Hall, Seattle. Thanks for coming on the show to tell us about it.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
So, I'm intrigued by your origin story. You were born in Evanston and grew up playing piano in the greater Chicago area. But I gather it wasn't until you moved to the Northwest that you became acquainted with the great Chicago school of free jazz. Is that true?
Yeah, that's definitely true. As you said, I spent a lot of time in Chicago going out to hear music, but it was mostly blues and boogie woogie and classical music and various other things. And it wasn't until I moved to Olympia, Washington to go to Evergreen State College that I got introduced to the AACM, the Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians, through concerts by Leroy Jenkins and Anthony Braxton and a number of other people.
And you went to Evergreen State originally to study environmental science.
That's right. And then I decided to spend the summer out there, the first year I was out there, and I saw a sign for jazz piano lessons up in a local restaurant. And I thought I should get back into playing piano again. So I sort of did those on a whim and pretty quickly switched my concentration to music.
So you studied music at Evergreen State. You also went to Cornish for a while. What is it that led you there?
During the middle of working at Evergreen, I spent a summer out in Colorado and went to the Naropa Institute. And there I met the members of Oregon, Paul McCandless and Ralph Towner and those guys. And they introduced me to Art Landy, who was teaching at Cornish. So I decided to spend my next year up at Cornish studying with Art, and then also got to study with Gary Peacock and Julian Priester and a number of great people who were teaching up there.
So you really had a wide range of exposure, didn't you? From the Paul Winter modal jazz of Oregon to the free jazz of Gary Peacock, who was Albert Eiler's bassist. And Julian Priester kind of had his hands in multiple communities.
Yeah, and when I first started studying jazz in Olympia, I was learning to play bebop,
Mm-hmm.
and had some great lessons with Bert Wilson while I was there. And also got to meet Barbara Donald and Sonny Simmons when they came through town. So I really did get exposed to a range of music. But the other thing that started happening when I was at Evergreen was I was listening to a lot of records and discovered Cecil Taylor. I discovered Don Pullen. I discovered Muhal Richard Abrams, and Andrew Hill. And, it was the combination of all these things that really kind of inspired me to keep going.
After Cornish, you studied for a bit in Boston before moving to New York, where you studied composition with Henry Threadgill, who is also from Chicago. He just celebrated his 80th birthday. He's a saxophonist by trade. What did you learn from him?
Oh, gosh. Well, I learned a lot from Henry, but, you skipped over a few things because in Boston, I studied with Rand Blake. And that was mostly ear training, wasn't really working at the piano with him. And then I went and moved to New York and started studying with Jackie Byard and Don Pullen.
Okay.
And after that, I started taking lessons with Henry Threadgill, as you mentioned. And Henry's actually plays a multi-woodwind player. And he basically showed me how he approaches composing. And he had developed his own system that he would refer to it as kind of an organic way of composing. He would start with, say, a small cell, whether it was a phrase or a melody or just a tone row of some kind. And then he'd analyze the intervals in it and had a number of procedures, not unlike contemporary classical music or new music. And then would do various permutations of those things. And everything in the piece would grow out of that initial cell. And the thing that was interesting to me about that was that I had grown up in a house designed by Frank Lloyd Wright, and he had a very similar philosophy about the house or the building growing out of the site it was in, and everything kind of referring to a certain motif that he would begin with. So, that made a lot of sense to me when I started working with Henry.
So it's taking the language of Schoenberg and Ives, since we're celebrating his 150th birthday tonight, and applying it to the realm of improvised music.
Yeah, although Henry's main people were Bartók and Varese and a few other people, but for sure I was certainly listening to and studying Ives and Schoenberg.
That's Threadgill that we've been hearing in the background. Now, you're performing in Seattle as part of this year's Earshot Jazz Festival, which is also hosting a series of concerts honoring the music of Butch Morris. We had Wayne Horvitz on the show last week to talk about that. You and Wayne both worked with Morris. You played on his Dust to Dust album together. What influences did you take from him?
Oh gosh, Butch was such an amazing teacher, and I was fortunate I played with him in a corps ensemble for about 10 years. But I remember that first recording session we did with Wayne, and I believe Wayne was a producer or a co-producer of that recording.
He did produce Dust to Dust.
Yeah. Anyway, I got to work with Butch during a transition period for him, because Dust to Dust was maybe the last thing he did once he started doing the conduction stuff, where he was also working with pre-composed material.
This was 1991.
Yeah. So there were a number of beautiful melodies and chord sequences that we were using as starting points. But then Butch would, he was actually conducting in the studio and giving signs and gestures for people to improvise in various ways, perhaps creating backgrounds, perhaps coming out and soloing. But he was really combining pre-composed material with the conduction signs. And then later, after that, he often switched to just using the conduction signs and not using the pre-composed material.
That's Dust to Dust that we're hearing now. And it's going to get its own tribute concert at Earshot Jazz Festival a week after your performance, Sunday, November 3rd at the Royal Room with Wayne Horvitz. One thing about that album is there's no bass player. It doesn't have the conventional rhythm section. Earlier tonight we were listening to The Same River Twice, which is one of your first albums as a band leader, recorded 5 years later. And that doesn't have a bass player either. You've got Eric Friedlander on cello. Was there an influence there?
I didn't think about that in relation to Butch, but I did, Henry had Deidre Murray on some of his records and now is still working with a cellist. But I think it was more just that general ethos in New York at that time amongst the AACM, but also on the downtown scene, that, one didn't have to write for conventional instruments or instrumentation. And what I liked about working with cello, and still do, is that it gives me room to play bass function or to play on the low end of the piano without getting in the way of the bass player.
Well, that brings us to Fire and Water Quintet, the group that you're bringing to Seattle next Sunday. You formed this band in 2019. It duplicates the instrumentation of The Same River Twice, but with Mary Halverson's guitar replacing the trumpet. The other musicians are Ingrid Laubrock, Tomika Reed, and Leslie Mock on drums, originally Susie Ibarra. It's an all-female group. How did that lineup come together?
Well, I was invited to do a week at the Stone in the summer of...
That's John Zorn's space in New York.
Right. In 2019. And I was presenting, I think I had 5 nights and was going to present a different thing each night. And the other 4 nights I presented bands I had been working with and had written music for. But I thought it would be fun to have one night where I just put together a group of people I thought would be empathetic improvisers. So I had played with each of them individually, and I knew that some of them were playing with each other. But I just thought, well, this would be really fun. And I'll just make a roadmap of different duos and trios and so on. But right before the as I was getting ready for the concert, I realized I had a number of sketches for compositions that I hadn't finished, and I could maybe bring in some of this material as starting points for some of the improvisation. And that turned into the For the Love of Fire and Water, the suite that we recorded on our first record.
And where does the name come from, Fire and Water?
Well, I ended up basing those pieces on or took inspiration from a series of drawings by the post-abstract expressionist, maybe I would say, American artist Cy Twombly.
Mm-hmm.
And he had a series of drawings called For the Love of Fire and Water. Each piece corresponds to a drawing.
And there are 10 of them in each set. We sampled 3 of the pieces earlier in the program, and the quintet has now released a second album called Hear the Light Singing, which we'll sample momentarily. How does it compare to the first album?
Well, the Hear the Light Singing are these insertions that I put into the original suite For the Love of Fire and Water. So we might have 2 or 3 more open improvised things that were like either text instructions or, some pre-composed material, but a lot of open improvising on the first record that I kind of choreographed or orchestrated, if you will. And then in the second one, the insertions are real, almost fully notated pieces that still use improvisation to develop them, but it's a very different kind of approach than we took on the first record.
Now, it's still a little unusual to find a small combo that has both keyboards and a guitar. Is that a case where you chose the instrument, or Mary Halverson in particular?
Well, for sure I was choosing Mary Halverson in particular, but I had Liberty Eldman in Snowy Egret, that quintet, so I'd been using guitar for a while, and I love the combination of piano and guitar. I think it's beautiful, and I think the main thing is you can't get caught up in conventional rhythm section rules. You have to really think about how each person is contributing to the harmony and the melody and the overall texture.
You'll be touring some more with Fire and Water Quintet after the Seattle gig. You've got engagements in Sacramento, Albuquerque, and a small town near Aspen, Colorado. And then what comes next for you? What should we be on the lookout for from Myra Melford?
Well, a couple things. I have a new record that just came out in August called Tomorrowland, and that's by a quartet called Lux Quartet that I co-lead with the great drummer and composer Allison Miller. And that record features Scott Cawley on bass and Dana Stevens on saxophones. And we'll be touring quite a bit next year, both in Europe and in the US. And then I just recorded and mixed a new trio recording that's coming out in the spring on Intact Records, and that's with a group I'm calling Splash, with Michael Formanek on bass and Chess Smith on drums and vibes. And we'll be touring next year to support that release.
We're hearing a taste of the Tomorrowland album. You're definitely keeping busy.
Yeah, that's for sure. Very fortunate.
Myra Melford has been speaking with us from Berkeley, California. She'll be appearing with her Fire and Water Quintet on Sunday, October 27th at Town Hall, Seattle, as part of this year's Earshot Jazz Festival. Show is at 7:30 in the Forum space at Town Hall, not the Great Hall. Just walk downhill to the west side of the building to find it. Tickets and information are at earshot.org, and we look forward to welcoming her back to the Northwest. Myra, it's great to chat with you. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you in Seattle.
Great. Thank you so much, Michael. It's been my pleasure.
And now let's hear Fire and Water Quintet, some selections from Hear the Light Singing on Flotation device.